On December 17th, 1968, in a remote stretch of woods in Georgia, a woman named Barbara was told to lie down in a little box about the size of a coffin. A lid was then placed over her and screwed into place as Barbara began to scream. Horrifyingly, soon enough, her screams were muffled, then completely silent as dirt was shoveled onto the box until Barbara was buried alive. This is her horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Barbara Mackle had not planned to spend the last days before Christmas break sick in a motel room in Atlanta, but by mid-December of 1968, that's exactly where she was. She was a student at Emory University, and like a lot of other people on campus during an outbreak, she had come down with the Hong Kong flu right in the middle of midterm exam week. So instead of heading straight home to Coral Gables, Florida, she ended up in a nearby roadway inn with her mother Jane, who had traveled to Atlanta to help Barbara get through it. The two then planned to make the drive to Florida together once Barbara was well enough to go. It wasn't an ideal setup, but it made sense considering the circumstances. Barbara was sick, run down, and trying to get through exams, and Jane was there to keep an eye on her, make sure Barbara had what she needed, and get her home for Christmas as soon as she could. At some point on the night of December 16th, Barbara's close friend Stuart Woodward stopped by for a visit and to check on her before he headed back to campus. Neither Barbara nor Jane had any idea at that moment that Stuart's name would soon be used against them. A few hours before dawn on December 17th, their lives changed forever. At around 4 in the morning, someone knocked on the door of their room. Any knock at that hour would immediately put most people on edge, and it certainly confused the mother and daughter inside. Jane then got herself out of bed to find out who it was. A man outside identified himself as a detective, and he said he was there because Stuart had been involved in an accident on the way back to Emory. From inside the room, still groggy and after being startled awake, Jane was told that there had been a traffic accident and that Stuart was unfortunately in one of the cars that collided. Upon hearing this, Jane unlatched the door and swung it open. The pair on the other side then forced their way in immediately. They were wearing ski masks, and at least one of them was armed with a shotgun. Any illusion that this was a late-night police visit disappeared in an instant. Jane was then shoved face down into the bed and restrained. Duct tape was used to gag her, and a Venetian blind cord was wrapped around her arms and legs. In some accounts of what happened in those first few moments, she was also chloroformed as the intruders worked to overpower both women as fast as possible. Barbara, meanwhile, still sick and caught in the middle of being awakened in the middle of the night, was suddenly realizing this was not a misunderstanding or a warning about Stuart. She was about to be kidnapped. The people who had come through the door knew exactly what they were doing. They had a story prepared and moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested what they were doing had been thought through in advance. Once Jane was completely incapacitated, the intruders grabbed Barbara, who was still in her nightgown, and ushered her out of the room and into the freezing temperatures outside. Somewhere outside that motel room, a car was waiting, and somewhere beyond the lights of downtown Atlanta, something else had already been prepared for her. Barbara didn't know it yet, but the people who had taken her were not planning to hold her in a house or move her from one motel to another. They had something much stranger and far more terrifying in mind. And as the car pulled away into the December darkness, their plan was entering its final stages. The car carried Barbara away from the motel and into the cold Georgia night while her mother was still tied up back in the room. She had been pulled out of the room so fast there had been barely time to understand what was happening, let alone prepare for it. But even still, she couldn't help but notice that the people who had taken her were not acting like panicked criminals improvising. They were headed somewhere specific with her. And soon enough, that destination would be clear. It was a remote pine stand off South Berkeley Lake Road in Gwinnett County near Lawrenceville, roughly 30 miles northeast of Atlanta. It was isolated, wooded, and well away from the motel where Barbara had been taken. And waiting there for her was the real center of the plot, a narrow, coffin-like container buried in a shallow trench. It was a box that had been prepared in advance for one purpose only. Barbara was going to be sealed inside it and left underground. The box itself had been built with a frightening level of care. It was reinforced with fiberglass and buried beneath about 1.5 feet of soil. Inside, it had been equipped with supplies meant to keep someone alive for several days. There was a battery-powered lamp and food selected to provide enough calories and nutrients to sustain the person trapped inside. There was also water, a chemical toilet, toilet paper, and even sanitary napkins. 2 plastic pipes ran upward to provide outside air as a sort of ventilation system. There were even typed instructions inside explaining how to operate the light, the sump pump, and the air system. Whoever designed it had thought about nearly everything. Before she was placed inside, one of the kidnappers injected Barbara with a tranquilizer. As that happened, the mechanics of the box were explained to her in precise terms, as if she were being briefed on equipment rather than being prepared for a burial. What she was not told was that the water stored inside had been laced with a mild, tasteless sedative. The idea apparently was to keep her from panicking, and it revealed that even her fear had been planned for in advance. When the explanation was finished, Barbara was forced to lie down inside the box. One of the kidnappers then took a photograph of her, but the first shot was rejected because Barbara was not smiling in it. He then made her do it again, this time telling her to, quote, smile for daddy. The result was a haunting image that would soon come to live in the case files. Then came the moment when there was no longer any room to pretend this might stop short of the unthinkable. The lid was fastened down with 20 heavy-duty screws, each about 3.5 inches in length. Once those screws were driven in, there was no possibility of Barbara getting out on her own. As the kidnapper shoveled soil over the top of the now closed box, Barbara began to scream. She continued this as the sound of dirt striking the lid grew fainter, muffled by the increased weight and quantity of earth piled on top. Within moments, the outside world disappeared for Barbara as the sounds of shoveling moved farther and farther away until there was nothing left but darkness and the knowledge that she had been buried alive. Prior to being put in the box, Barbara was told by the kidnappers that her condition would be monitored every few hours, but that wasn't true at all. After burying her, the kidnappers simply left. They drove away, returned to their motel, cleaned up, checked out, and began a long drive back to Miami while listening to the radio reports about the kidnapping they had just committed. Barbara, meanwhile, was left alone beneath the Georgia soil with only the systems inside the box and her own ability to remain calm. The people who had entombed her were gone, and whatever chance she had depended entirely on whether the world above could figure out where she had been hidden before time ran out. By the time Barbara was being carried into the Georgia woods, her mother was still back at the Roadway Inn, bound and gagged on the bed. Jane had watched the strangers force their way into the room, overpower her within seconds, and take her daughter off into the night before she had any chance to fight back. Once the car was gone, all she could do was try to get herself loose. And like Barbara, it didn't take long for her to realize that whatever just happened was not random. It was not some desperate robbery gone wrong. These people, whoever they were, had come for Barbara specifically. Jane would eventually manage to free herself enough to call for help, but by then, the most important window had already closed. Barbara was no longer somewhere nearby. Even though her call for help was made quickly, the kidnapping had just been executed with so much speed. As investigators began trying to understand the scene, one fact stood out almost immediately. Barbara was not some anonymous college student. She was the 20-year-old daughter of Robert Mackel, a hugely successful Florida land developer and co-founder of the Deltona Corporation. This was a major home building company that helped shape enormous residential developments in the state. In other words, Barbara came from the exact kind of family a kidnapper might view as capable of paying a massive ransom. This was a fact to help set the stage for one of the most bizarre kidnapping cases the FBI would ever investigate. Back down in the ground, there was no way for Barbara to track the larger drama unfolding above her. She didn't know that her disappearance was triggering a huge law enforcement response, or that her father's name and wealth were crucial to her kidnapping. All she knew for certain was what the kidnappers had shown her before sealing the box. As the hours passed, the reassurance they had given her that someone would be checking on her began to fade as she realized that no one was coming back. That meant Barbara had to narrow down her world to what she could control. She had instructions for operating the box, food, water, and more than anything else, her own mind. So rather than let herself spiral into a panic, she focused on survival. She imagined what Christmas morning back at home would be like over and over again, and she held onto that image as a future she intended to get back to. She also sang every church hymn she could remember while trapped, basically anything she could do to keep herself calm. While Barbara fought to stay calm underground, the people who had put her there were on the next phase of their plan, and the demand was enormous for its time. Her captors wanted $500,000 from Robert for the safe return of his daughter. The 4.5-page ransom letter explained that Barbara had been taken to a remote wooded area and stuffed inside a box that was lying underground. And like the rest of the incident, what made the note even stranger was how carefully it had been handled. Before the kidnapping ever took place, the letter had been sealed inside a glass tube and buried beneath a rock near a palm tree in the family's garden in Coral Gables. It was yet another sign that the abductors had clearly tried to think through every step, but here's where the first mistake was made. After receiving the horrifying news, Robert would actually arrange to give the men the money. However, the first attempt to collect the ransom fell apart when 2 policemen happened to drive by the drop site at the pickup time. This was enough to spook the kidnappers into abandoning the attempt and running off on foot. In the chaos, they left behind their car, and that abandoned car became one of the most important breaks in the entire case. Inside of it, the FBI found photographs of a man wearing a policeman's hat and registration papers with the name George Deacon. The extortion effort didn't end there, though. A second ransom drop was carried out successfully, meaning the money changed hands without any interruption. But even after all of that, there was still no immediate word from the kidnappers telling authorities where Barbara had been buried. Backing up a little bit though, the man actually at the center of the plot was 23-year-old Gary Stephen Christ. His accomplice was 26-year-old Ruth Eisman Shire, a graduate student from Honduras. The two had met through the Marine Science Institute at the University of Miami, where Gary was employed and Ruth was studying marine biology. They became romantically involved after taking part in a university-sponsored research trip to Bermuda. Gary was a large man, about 6 feet tall and weighing roughly 240 pounds. Ruth, meanwhile, was much smaller, around 5'2" and 110 pounds, but that contrast probably helped them in some ways. Together, they didn't necessarily look like the kind of couple many people would picture carrying out a meticulously planned abduction. And from the available details, it's clear that Gary in particular had been thinking about this for some time. At some point in November of 1968, Gary settled on Barbara as his target. He researched her, chose her deliberately, and then began constructing what he repeatedly called the capsule. He built it inside a small construction trailer parked in the grounds of the Marine Science Institute, a place to which only he had access to. That gave him privacy and time to create the central tool of the kidnapping without interference. The capsule was designed to keep its occupant alive underground for 7 days. It measured 6 feet long, or 183 centimeters, 23 inches high and 23 inches wide, or 58 by 58 centimeters, and weighed around 240 pounds, about the same as Gary. It was long enough and wide enough to hold a person, but not much more than that. The height and width made it brutally cramped. It was a narrow, human-sized compartment engineered around survival in the most limited sense of the word. He ensured that Barbara would have air, food, water, and instructions, just enough of everything to keep a person alive while ransom negotiations played out. After it was constructed, Gary even convinced Ruth to test it herself. At one point, he had her lie down inside it for several hours with the lid closed. The pair wanted to know whether the system worked and whether the occupant could function inside it, and presumably whether the whole setup could do what Gary intended it to do. This test would end up being a success, and a few days before the kidnapping, the operation moved north. On December 13th, Gary and Ruth loaded the capsule and its contents into a Volvo station wagon and drove from Miami to Atlanta. Once there, Gary found an isolated wooded area where the pair spent a day digging a grave just big enough for the capsule. They then placed the capsule in the hole and concealed both it and the displaced dirt with brush from the surrounding woods. Then in the days leading up to the kidnapping, Gary and Ruth went looking for Barbara around Emory University's campus. They checked dorms and classrooms before discovering that she was ill and temporarily staying at the Roadway Inn with her mother. Once the pair was settled at a nearby motel, Gary called the Roadway Inn and asked for Jane's room. When Jane answered, he told her that he had a certified letter for her and would deliver it later. The final touches on the scheme then took place the night before the kidnapping. Gary and Ruth ate at a diner where a local police officer was seated at the counter. His cap was hanging on a hook near the door, and when Gary left, he stole it, deciding that posing as a police officer would be the easiest way to get inside the room in the early morning hours. He also realized that police officers don't usually have full beards, so shortly before the abduction, he shaved his face clean. The pair even took practice photos with their Polaroid camera to make sure it worked, since they intended to photograph Barbara after the kidnapping as proof she was still alive. Luckily for Barbara though, Gary and Ruth made a huge mistake when they left their car behind. After recovering the abandoned car, the FBI followed that trail to the University of Miami. There they determined that George Deacon was connected to the Marine Science Institute and that George was apparently known for building ventilated boxes as part of his work. Agents also found out from George's boss that there was a woman at the university he spent a lot of time with, and that woman was Ruth. Then another lucky break came in from Georgia. A local man contacted the FBI and said that he had recently bought a small trailer from someone, only to discover odd paperwork left inside. The FBI examined the material and found letters addressed to both George and Gary. The real collapse, though, came when the FBI compared fingerprints from the abandoned car with prints already on file for Gary, who had escaped from a California prison in 1966 while doing time for car theft. The match showed that George and Gary were the same person, and with that, they knew who was likely behind Barbara's kidnapping. Obviously, though, this wasn't the same as knowing where Barbara had been buried. She was still underground, somewhere in Georgia, and the clock was still ticking. The breakthrough on that aspect of the case finally came on December 20th, when Gary called and gave an FBI operator directions to Barbara's location. Even then, though, the directions were vague and imprecise, but it was the first real path anyone had towards Barbara's grave. Agents were then dispatched towards the Lawrenceville area, where the burial site was believed to be hidden. By this point, she was already underground for more than 3 days, and there was no room left for delay. In one of those details that would have been darkly funny if the situation had not been so desperate, the first wave of agents actually arrived in the gravesite without shovels. They had rushed out in excitement, focused on getting to the scene as quickly as possible, but none of them thought to bring the most basic tool they might need to dig a buried woman out of the ground. But in any case, even after getting there, the gravesite wasn't easy to locate. The burial site was prepared in advance to blend into the landscape, and again, Gary's directions given to the FBI operator left a lot to be desired. Agents spread out and began searching more or less at random, combing the woods in the hope that some sign of disturbed ground or concealed brush would stand out. Hours passed with little to show for it, and as the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade. Dusk would mean reduced visibility and more confusion. It also meant that there was the possibility that they could be close to the grave and miss it entirely. As a result of this, the search effort grew rapidly. The FBI set up its base in Lawrenceville, and more than 100 agents spread through the area. Some dug at areas with their hands, while others used whatever they could find. They shouted Barbara's name to the woods, hoping that somehow she might hear them and respond. But buried beneath soil in a sealed box, there was little chance of that. Then at around 4 in the afternoon, one of the agents spotted something small but crucial. On top of some brush, he noticed what looked like a bit of freshly disturbed red Georgia soil. He called the others over, and the search now from a broad, frantic sweep of the woods to one exact patch of ground. Once the agents converged on the spot, the mood changed instantly. Their search had been noisy and scattered before, but now it turned to focused digging. When the agents finally dug down to the buried box and opened it, Barbara was still alive inside. By the time they reached her, she was badly dehydrated and weak, but otherwise unharmed. She was conscious and lucid, but too weak to stand on her own. Agents then began to cheer when it became clear that she was still alive. After she was pulled up and looking at the men who dug her out, in her first words since being buried, she apparently told them that they were the handsomest men she'd ever seen. In the aftermath, with Barbara found and accounted for, Gary didn't remain free for long. Eventually, he was captured off the Florida coast in a speedboat he had bought using some of the ransom money. Ruth remained uncaught for a bit longer, though. She wasn't arrested until May 5th, 1969, in Norman, Oklahoma. She had applied for a job at a hospital, and during the background check, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation found a fingerprint match. Ruth was then convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. She served 4 of those years before being paroled and deported back to her native Honduras. Gary, meanwhile, was convicted in 1969 and was sentenced to life in prison, which on paper sounds like the end of the story for him, but he was somehow paroled after serving only 10 years. Then, incredibly, he received a pardon that allowed him to attend medical school. He then went on to actually practice medicine in Indiana before losing his license in 2003 for lying about disciplinary trouble during his residency. Then in March of 2006, he was arrested again, this time on a sailboat off the Alabama coast with 14 kilos of illicit substances, reportedly worth around $1 million at the time. He was sentenced to 5 years and 5 months in prison before being released in November of 2010. Then in 2012, a federal judge in Alabama revoked his supervised release after he left the country without permission and sailed to Cuba and South America. He was then sentenced to another 40 months in prison and was released again in 2015. He remains a free man to this day. Barbara's side of the story moved in a very different direction. She was returned to her family after her rescue, and she later married and had children. In 1970, she published a book about the ordeal called 83 Hours Till Dawn. The story would go on to inspire a 1990 television movie and even a loose exploitation film adaptation in the early 1970s. The Mackle family maintained that Barbara remained relatively unfazed publicly, though she had very few public appearances over the years. At the last check-in with her, she was living a simple life in the Atlanta area with her family. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.